Two teenage girls were taking a shortcut to get home. Tragically, that shortcut would lead to their brutal murders. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. Viewer discretion is advised. This particular case will take us down to Houston, Texas, and the date is 1993. Elizabeth Christine Pena was born on June 21st, 1977. She was born and raised in Houston, Texas, which is where she spent all of her life. When this case occurred, Elizabeth was only 16 years old. She had just barely started life. She was a promising young teenager who had a very bright future ahead of her, looking forward to things like high school prom and college and getting her first job. Elizabeth led a life full of joy and friends and happiness. She made friends really easy. Everyone loved being around her, and she was a very poised young woman. Elizabeth was a young girl who just simply brought joy to every single person she came into contact with. It's just kind of who she was. Elizabeth had a warmth to her, a warmth that you really don't see a lot in, teenagers. Elizabeth had been friends with a 14-year-old teenager. She was 14 at the time this case occurred. They had been friends for a couple of years, and her friend's name was Jennifer Ertman. Jennifer Lee Ertman was born on August 15th, 1978. Everyone in Jennifer's life described her, even at the age of 14, as a very vivacious young woman, full of life, full of energy. She embodied what it meant to be joyful, and that joy tended to be very infectious to people around her. Jennifer was that type of person who was a beacon to a lot of people, a beacon of light. She had a laugh that would start other people laughing because it was that infectious. She was silly and goofy and loved to have fun. And most importantly, Jennifer, along with Elizabeth, they embodied innocence, really. I mean, these are two teenage girls, and what ends up happening to them is they went through an absolute nightmare. They went through hell. They went through pain. And the people that did this to them just did not seem to care. This takes us to June 24th, 1993. 14-year-old Jennifer and 16-year-old Elizabeth went to a friend's apartment for a small party. They had gone together. Around 11:30 p.m., the two girls realized that they were almost at their curfew and they needed to get home. The plan was to walk to, I think, Elizabeth's house, where then Jennifer could get a cab or get a ride home. Elizabeth lived closer to the apartment where they were having this party at. And because both girls were responsible, they wanted to make sure they did not break that curfew. But they were running a little behind. And so what's believed happened is they decided to take a shortcut through a park, a shortcut they took all the time. So they would have cut across some railroad tracks that were next to a park. But Jennifer and Elizabeth never got to Elizabeth's apartment. The family became kind of concerned. So they basically, it sounds like they each called each other's families' places and said, hey, have you seen so-and-so? Have you seen Jennifer? Have you seen Elizabeth? And neither side of the family had seen either of the girls that night. Both sides of the family also weren't totally concerned because it wasn't unusual for them to maybe spend the night at the apartment where they were at. It was maybe a little strange because the girls, again, being very responsible, typically would call their parents to say, hey, we're going to be staying the night. And usually that was allowed, but they didn't get a phone call that night. And when they realized by the following morning, both families, that their daughters, their loved one wasn't home yet, that's when they became incredibly worried. They would contact the friend whose apartment they had gone to and realize that both Jennifer and Elizabeth had left the party around 11:30 p.m. And now panic is setting in because these are two teenagers, very responsible ones at that. What's going on? Something is unusual. And at the time, Houston police was bombarded with a large amount of homicides at that time. And so when the families reported the girls missing, they did not jump up the priority list, unfortunately, right away. So another one of those things too, where it's like, they're teenagers, they run away. Teenagers run away all the time. So that's just probably what happened. I say this all the time, that it's just so annoying that that's how this stuff was handled. If a child is reported missing, you investigate that shit right away. I don't care. Maybe they did run away, but what if they didn't? And that's the important part, the what if they didn't part. What if they were abducted and there's still time to get them before they're killed? Well, let's wait 3 days. It's like, ugh. But the families weren't going to be waiting around for the police to start this. So the families, they would begin searching. They would begin knocking on doors and calling friends and the families and all that. They would canvass neighborhoods. They would walk through wooded areas. This is all the family doing it. About 4 days go by when the anonymous Crime Stoppers tip line receives an anonymous call from a man who does not want to say who he is, but he tells them where you can actually find the 2 girls. And he said that both girls were in fact deceased. When the Crime Stoppers team gets this to the authorities go to the area where the man said the girls would be, but they were not there. And so apparently the guy who called didn't, he noticed this and said, ugh. And so he ends up calling the police a second time. So he's no longer calling the anonymous tip line. So now he has to say who he is. But he says, well, okay, I think you can actually find the 2 girls in this location. This time he's saying that the girls are at T.C. Jester Park, which was nearby those railroad tracks where typically the girls would cut across, but it was also surrounded by a big wooded area. They learned that the tipster who called in, his name was Joe Cantu. So following Joe's new tip, the police go to this area. They go deep into the woods, and they do in fact find Jennifer and Elizabeth. Both of them, tragically, are dead. Both girls are found completely nude, and they were also decomposed pretty badly. This is the summer in Texas, and unfortunately the heat tends to rapidly increase the rate of decomposition. And unfortunately, because of how bad it was, you could not actually recognize them by their faces. The clothing of the girls were scattered around them. That helped kind of identify them, but they had to pull dental records to confirm who these 2 girls were, and that's how they confirmed that they were both Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. The coroner would determine that both girls had been raped repeatedly, and both girls had been strangled. Amongst all the clothing that they found at the crime scene, they also found a piece of like a red leather belt, and it looked like it had been broken in half, and the other half of the belt wasn't there at the crime scene. The crime scene itself, with it being this kind of heavily, dense wooded area where people would throw trash all over the place, unfortunately, it really did make collecting evidence difficult because, they don't know what's actually attached to this crime scene and what isn't, but they do collect everything. They have like a beer can that they collect because you never know. I mean, someone might say like, yeah, they were drinking beer and then they killed these 2 girls. And that can help kind of like connect these 2 things together. Police will talk to this Joe Cantu person who was the one who called in the tip. He said that on the night in question, he and his wife were at home when his younger brother, Peter Cantu, came home. Peter was with a group of friends, and they were laughing. They were like pushing each other around, like joking, and like they were in great spirits, it seemed like. And they were openly talking about what they just did to these 2 teenage girls, who at that point, when Joe was hearing them say this, no one knew that the girls were missing yet. But they were talking about it. They were bragging about it. They were joking about it, that they raped these girls and that they strangled them. This was a group of young men who did not care about what they just did. And so when the news broke on the actual news, and when Joe Cantu heard this, he pieced it together going, oh my God, they weren't just like messing around. They're actually talking about how they actually killed someone. And so that's when he reports his own brother, basically. I mean, he doesn't say his brother's name on the call at that point, but he heard Peter say where the girls would be, And I think that's where the communication kind of got mixed up, because I don't think he heard them correctly, but he kind of pieced it together. And that's when he went to Crime Stoppers and then the police. He cooperated fully with the authorities. He had no issues throwing his brother under the bus. So police reach out to Peter and all of these friends. When police get to the houses that some of these kids live in, they find pieces of jewelry. They would later determine that these jewelry items, they were confirmed to belong to either Elizabeth or Jennifer. So now they have the murder victim's stolen property in the possession of this group of young men. Peter Cantu was described as the leader of what he called the Black and White Gang. This consisted of 18-year-old Jose Medellin, Jose's 14-year-old brother Vinacio, 17-year-old Efren Perez, 18-year-old Derek Sean O'Brien, and 17-year-old Raul Villarreal. Peter himself was 18 years old. They uncover what happened that night. On that night, June 24th, 1993, the gang was at this park. They were drinking beer and they were having fun. The beer can they found near the bodies later would be confirmed to belong to these young men. But the reason why they were there was to initiate a new member into their gang, and that was Raul Villarreal. Also there that night initially was a man named Roman Sandoval and Roman's brother Frank Sandoval. Now, Roman and Frank, they began to walk away from this initiation before the girls were essentially captured by this group. However, Frank and Roman would see the two girls walking the direction where the other 6 young men were. They didn't say anything to each other. Nothing like that happened, but they did see the 2 girls. And it's of note that Roman and Frank, when they heard about these 2 missing girls who had, last been seen walking towards this direction, they never came forward to police, even with suspicions that their friends did this. But back at this gang initiation, it consisted of them basically beating up Raul Villarreal. He had to fight each member of the gang, and this lasted 5 to 10 minutes. Once he was able to successfully fight all of the other members, he was then officially initiated into the gang. They then continued to drink beer and mess around, and that is when they saw Jennifer and Elizabeth cutting across the park. It was later determined that Jennifer and Elizabeth would have normally taken a different route to get to Elizabeth's home, but because they were running a little behind, they took a shortcut through the park next to these railroad tracks. And it was that shortcut that unfortunately put them directly in the paths of these 6 men. According to later confessions, the girls then passed by Joe Medellin, and that's when he grabbed hold of Elizabeth and yanked her away and dragged her down a hill. Jennifer at that point was, if she wanted to, she could have run away. She could have fled the area to prevent herself from being involved here. But Jennifer, being who Jennifer was, couldn't leave her friend. She just couldn't. But it was at a point where Jennifer was screaming for help, and she was, according to the confessions, it looked like Jennifer was debating running to get help. But before she could do anything, they grabbed her next and threw her down this hill. What happened next was, it was awful. 5 of the 6 young men would gang rape both girls multiple times. This was done orally, anally, and vaginally. The 14-year-old Vinacio, according to him, he just stood there and watched all of this happening. At one point, Peter looked over at 14-year-old Vinacio and said, "We're going to have to kill these 2 girls. We're going to be killing them." Peter, the leader, instructed the others to take the girls farther into the woods and said, "We have to kill them now." They threw both girls to the ground, where Peter and the other men would kick both of these girls in their heads. One of the men was wearing steel-toed boots, and they hit the girls the hardest. So hard that the teeth was knocked out of their mouths. Peter then would later admit that he took his boot and he stomped on Jennifer's throat and pressed down to prevent her from moving and breathing. Then they took a belt and they began to strangle the girls. It was so forceful that the belt ripped in half. They then took handkerchiefs and began to wrap it around the girls' necks and strangle them until they stopped breathing. And then all of them would take turns jumping on and stomping on the girls' necks to either break them or just to make sure that they were dead. They laughed about it. They were actually laughing while they were doing this. It was fun for them. It was like a game to them. They all then went back to Peter's house, which is where Joe saw his brother and the friends come in, and they were continuing to laugh about it and joke about it and talk about it openly. And then at that point, Peter, who had stolen the jewelry off the girls, was passing the jewelry out to the other men. Here you go, here's your trophy, basically. So once police were able to gather all of this information in a simultaneous arrest, essentially, they would go to all the houses that these young men lived in, and this was on June 29th, 1993, and they would arrest them. At the homes, police would find the stolen jewelry that was later confirmed to belong to the girls. At Derek Sean O'Brien's home, they found the other half to the red belt that was used to strangle the two girls. And they were able to connect that belt directly to the crime scene. 5 of the 6 young men were charged with capital murder and rape. The youngest, Venancio, who was just 14 years old, was charged as a juvenile. To get each of these men to talk about each other to police was impossible. This was a gang after all, and you can't do that. You can't spill the beans on another gang member. You can't talk, because if you do, it'll be remembered forever, and you'll get killed for it, or you'll get your ass kicked for it, or whatever the case may be. But the police were able to obtain enough information from various small confessions from all of the men, where they would label this a raping frenzy, is what they did to these 2 girls. They then also confessed that each one of them literally took turns raping the 2 girls as the others watched and or held them down. They also went into detail about how they used the belt and how it broke, which was confirmed by the evidence. Then they said they used a handkerchief, which was later found as well and confirmed to be a part of the crime. They used a shoelace at one point, which was found and confirmed to be used during the crime. And what they end up doing is really unprecedented. Instead of trying all 6 of these young men during the same trial, they actually do 6 separate trials. But before 14-year-old Venancio Medellin can go on trial, he ends up taking a plea deal of aggravated sexual assault, and he was sentenced to the maximum that he could be allowed as a juvenile for those charges, which was 40 years in prison. And he had to testify against the other men at all the trials. And that's what they do. They have 5 separate trials where it's literally the same witnesses at every trial, the same evidence at every trial. Venancio is testifying against them at every trial. Peter Cantu was the first one of them to officially go on trial on January 31st, 1994. And these trials it was a circus, basically. I mean, this was national news at this point. What these young men did to these 2 teenage girls was a horrific nightmare that you can't even think is possible for someone to do, but it was done. And not only that, the fact of how flippant and how uncaring they were that they did this and how much they joked about it. It's just, these were 6 evil people. Even the kid, the 14-year-old, who stood by and did nothing and participated in the rapes. Evil, all of them, pure evil. I forgot to mention the 2 other individuals who had walked past Elizabeth and Jennifer before all of this occurred, the 2 other members of the gang, they were called to testify, and they both also testified against the young men, as did Peter's brother, Joe, and Joe's wife. They testified against them as well. The physical evidence and the testimony against all of them was incredibly airtight. And this was them. They did it. There was no questions about it. The physical evidence linked back to them as well. You have fingerprints and DNA that was on those beer cans and stuff found on the belt that all came back to them. On February 4th, 1994, Peter Cantu was the first one to be convicted of all charges, and he was sentenced to death. Derek O'Brien would go on trial next, and it was actually at Derek O'Brien's trial where another revelation was made. This was not the first murders. They had actually killed another young woman before, a young woman named Patricia Lopez. Patricia Lopez, who 6 months prior to Jennifer and Elizabeth's case, was also gang raped and murdered. And not only that, Patricia was disemboweled. They cut her up and they removed her insides. They collected DNA from Patricia Lopez's crime scene that was not hers. And when this revelation came out before Derek O'Brien's trial, they ran that DNA against these men, and it turned out to belong to Jose, or who would go by Joe Medellin. And so he was now directly, basically considered the main suspect in Patricia's case. I believe he specifically was also convicted of her murder. And then Derek O'Brien, they found a fingerprint on a beer can next to Patricia's remains that also linked to him. But I don't think he was convicted for Patricia's murder. But at this point, Peter Cantu, Raul Villarreal, Joe Jose Medellin, Efren Perez, and Derek Sean O'Brien, they are all found guilty of the murders and the rapes of the two girls. All of them, all 5 of them, are sentenced to death. And then the 14-year-old, like I said earlier, was sentenced to 40 years. The men would, I think, at some points attempt to appeal their convictions, but I mean, there was just no chance they were ever going to win those because, again, the evidence against them was overwhelming. There was just no way they were getting out of this. In July of 2006, Derek Sean O'Brien was executed by lethal injection. In 2008, Jose Joe Medellin was also executed. In 2010, Peter Cantu was executed. Years later, the Supreme Court had passed a new law that basically stated that crimes committed by people under the age of 18 could not be sentenced to death. And this was like a retroactive thing. So because of that, Efren Perez and Raul Villarreal, who were initially sentenced to death for the girls' murders and rapes, the sentences were tossed and they were reconvicted to life in prison. And not only that, both men are now eligible for parole, simply because they were 1 year under the age of 18. I'm so glad that they have a chance to live the rest of their lives free, possibly. Wow. Sarcasm. As a matter of fact, both men are eligible for parole for the first time in 2029. Hopefully, they are never paroled. Hopefully, they remain behind bars for the rest of their lives. Venancio is still, to this day, in prison. This was a heartbreaking story where 2 teenage girls who had barely gotten started with their lives, they were like best friends. They were just having a really fun night, and because they were responsible, they wanted to get home in time to not get in trouble, and they just took a shortcut to get home quicker. And that's all. Their shortcut led to their deaths. That's not their fault. It's not their fault at all. They couldn't have possibly known that this kind of thing would happen. Why these 6 men had to do what they did, I have no answers for you. All I know is that people who do this sort of thing, they deserve nothing. Nothing positive. And now 3 of the 6 of them are dead. And I am not losing any sleep over that. Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena did not deserve the pain and the torture of what they got. They did not deserve that level of fear. They deserve to live the rest of their lives. They deserve to go to their high school proms. They deserve to graduate from high school and go on to college and get a degree and have successful careers, and then start their own families, have their own kids, and watch their kids grow up. But all of that was squashed when 6 young evil monsters said, nah, we're going to take them away from everyone. And I know that 3 of those men are currently sitting in hell rotting. And the other 3, I hope eventually they find themselves in hell as well. None of this was worth it for them. And they got exactly what they deserved. And thankfully, Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena got the justice they very rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case, True Crime Maroony Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you're new here, hello, my name is Mike. I tell true crime stories here on YouTube, obviously. So please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing. Also hit the like, drop a comment, that way more people can see the video. Hit the bell so you're notified when I post new videos, yada, yada, yada. I do also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. The link to my TikTok is in the link tree in the description of this video below, so feel free to follow that. I do post compilation videos, though, at the beginning of every month of all the TikToks I made that previous month. So, also in that link tree, you'll find my case list. It's public for you to see. It's got 7,700 names on it now. It's in alphabetical order for the most part. If there's a name that you do not see on that case, just send me a quick email. My email is also listed below, but just send me the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened. I'll add it to the list. I pick my cases typically at random. I can't promise you when I'll cover that case, but eventually I will get to it. So, but that being said, that is it for this case, True Crime Maroony. So until the next one, ta-ta for nowsies. Awkward.